Hello, everyone. I want to watch a debate between Piers Morgan and Richard Dawkins regarding evolution, so let's listen into it.
There has to be a power that is greater than the human brain.
God is just a personification of human desires, a supernatural sky daddy.
So that's an interesting utterance here by Dawkins, right? Because that's basically an assumption that can be traced back to some evidence of how we work in our cultures, but I don't think it's ultimately secured. So it is for sure that some cultures use God as a sky daddy, as a divine gardener of evolution or whatever. But just because we invent God for our own purposes or we have a fantasy product of God doesn't mean that there isn't a higher power. But this is not my point here of the discussion. So I very much believe in evolution. I very much believe in what we call modern sciences, although it's unclear what that ultimately is. A lot of people say like, science is clear, we know what we do. No, I don't think like science has yet found its final form, to use a Hegelian phrase. But yeah, I think that also people who proclaim themselves to be scientists have to be careful with their utterances if they are really scientific. And I think Dawkins here in these statements actually extends he passes over the boundaries that are drawn for science, and that is explicitly to make statements, determined statements about what God really is. Now, can he say something like that that human cultures use images of God? Sure. Is it like somehow bound to how our brain works, how our anxieties work? Sure. But does it mean that the reference to God has no real reference point? Well, I mean, that's much more complicated. But this is not the major point here of the debate. I actually find way more interesting how Piers Morgan argues, and I think we can learn something about science if we look into that. So let's come to the first utterance he makes in that regard. So, okay, the first point here is that Piers Morgan clarifies his position that he believes in God, and he gives us some reasons why. Let's look if these reasons that he gives us are good reasons.
I do believe, for what it's worth, I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it comforting. I also find
So is the idea of comfort giving us any hints about the truth of God? Obviously not, right? We may betray ourselves, say we don't have cancer, while we actually have cancer. We may say it's good to believe in God, therefore God exists. Not a good argument. So, but I think his argument goes a bit further. Let's listen more.
As I said to you last time, I find it explains things which are otherwise completely inexplicable.
So, okay, believing in God explains things which are otherwise inexplicable. So, I think if I have a medical condition in my body, I might come up with a theory that sounds plausible, but which is not true. Let's say sugar nourishes cancer, or you have to do a rinsing of the body because you ate too much basal stuff and therefore you have all these conditions. Like, these are theories that are plausible. They may even be coherent and logical, but that doesn't make them true. So just because we have an explanation for something, while we cannot find another explanation, is not a good model of how to do sciences. We need something that confirms it with evidence, although, and I talk about that later, we also have to be careful about possible confirmation biases. But this is a very difficult topic in the theory of science.
And we had a guest on recently, Professor Stephen C. Meyer, who's a prominent believer in intelligent design, or what he calls the God hypothesis. He watched our last interview that you and I had, and this is what he said about it.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
So I always have a lot of commentators who say, well, nowadays we have science and we know how sciences work. Well, I don't think it's that clear. So I think we observe indeed that scientists often do something that is inference to the best cause and then use that as an hypothesis to either falsify it, which seems to be a very productive method, or to build a theory on the basis of confirmation with regard to this best cause, which is not such a good attempt, but which usually works to build new theories. If we, for example, look for Darwin, he first falsified a lot of other theories of Lamarck and maybe also under the influence of Lyell. But then he tried to formulate a theory that was like something like the inference to the best cause, and he sought a lot of evidence that would support his theory. So he tried to make his hypothesis lining up with the evidence that was available at that time. Now, this may be exposed to a confirmation hypothesis, which is a fallacy in inductive reasoning and which never gives us necessary knowledge. So this is especially problematic if you try to prove, for example, that climate change does not exist, and then you go to Google and you just find like a lot of examples that climate change does not exist. Or let's say you wanted to show that Santa Claus exists, and you come up with ideas like that a lot of children get presents the next day on Christmas Day. Now, is that inference to the best cause? Well, that is debatable, but here is like something that we can say is a confirmation bias that plays a role. So I think in that regard, science has many problems, and I have forgotten his name, stating that scientists usually simply do an inference to the best causes, largely oversimplifying the way sciences work.
And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And
so we have to say one thing: the idea that there's an origin of the universe like the Big Bang seems to me a hypothesis that is in line with a lot of theories, whereas we have to keep in mind that that is also one theory that is falsifiable. I mean, it seems to be fairly well tested with regard to all the equations that we have, but there are some caveats, and we could also say that the universe may be infinite in whatever has happened before. And so therefore, like, bringing it down to the straw man of what we have in science, and then probably pointing out some bad popular scientists who adamantly defend this thesis against, like, let's say, creationists, is misleading. It is really misleading. And so I think we should have the discourse on that in another way. Now, let's look at the kind of argument that he does in favor of sufficient reason. So I'm sorry. Sufficient reason is certainly an interesting argument, because we can say that whenever something gets caused by something else, that which causes it must be similar in kind. So material gets caused by material, but what happens if we ask, what is the sufficient reason for material? Well, obviously it cannot be material itself, because then we hadn't explained where material comes from. So there must be something different than material if we want to go that far. Now, I know for a fact that in like the physical theories nowadays, there is a claim that something can come from nothing, but we also have to keep in mind that this is not the absolute or philosophical nothing, but the nothing that is determined in physical terms. So that we then have an equation where we can say, well, that's how matter is generated from whatever this physical nothing is. So indeed, I think we have here metaphysical problems, but to say that there must be a divine creator that is more powerful than us, and like dismissing the hypothesis that it could also be just chaos that created this universe and that there is no further meaning to it. Like dismissing this thesis is also a little bit sloppy and not scientific.
So if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint.
So we have a typical problem of a certain kind of fallacy here. Let's call it the plausibility theory, where we have like the assumption of a few premises that are taken to be true. And then, of course, the conclusion that they draw, namely that God exists, cannot be false, right? So it's true by necessity. But it all depends on the premises that they have stated here, namely that the universe consists of matter, whatever that is, and that matter needs a cause. I mean, like going back to Aquinas, for example, he states also that the universe could be infinite without a beginning in time, but that time goes infinitely back, and that God is so powerful that he even creates an infinite universe of no beginning. So like the assumption that there must be a beginning is already problematic in itself. And then to say that matter must be caused by something that is not matter, that's like an operation of plausibility of how causes work. But what about the universe just being a probabilistic universe and the kind of causalities that we assume for our normal day of life don't work? So yeah, so we have here again a plausibility fallacy. And I want to say just because something is logical or plausible doesn't mean it's true.
A picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God.
Now you see, Richard Dawkins, this is the nub of, I think, my whole issue with your position on this. And you can respond, obviously, to what you just heard in a moment. But given your new book is about the genetic book of the dead, and it effectively takes us from here to in perpetuity on a genetic trail where each part of existence feeds the next and so on. And I totally subscribe to that. The genome of every body and every organization and so on.
So he subscribes to the genome and like a basic evolutionary theory. Maybe he's not a believer in creative design. But he says here basically that it's logical. Now, Darwin's theory is not true because it's logical, but because it's like covered by evidence. Moreover, it is not like a theory that simply makes sense. Like in Piers Morgan's mind, he says it simply makes sense. But if we look into Darwin's biography, how complicated it was to actually come up with this kind of theory that is not simply observable, but that until the 50s of the 20th century, needed a mathematical synthesis that also showed in probabilistic causes that this is very likely the case. Until that happened, like that theory was based on the like complicated, very complicated inference to what is the best cause. And this best cause, like in terms of evolution, could not be simply observed or was not simply something that is meaningful. So again, why is that the case? Because evolution happens probably, I mean, I'm not a complete expert on it, but happens in many, many millions of years with many, many, many tiny mutations and variations and selection processes that happen all the time. So, but these processes, we just cannot observe them. Darwin didn't have like striking examples. That's why he came up with so many examples in his book, The Origin of Species, where many people even criticized that it was too detailed. And Darwin took 15 years to collect this evidence. There was not like the fingerprint of nature on the smoking gun anywhere. There was not like the last kind of proof. There were just like many, many tiny evidences. And keep here in mind, what's the difference between evidence and a proof, right? A proof shows without any doubt that something must be true. Evidence is something that is collected so that we create a complete picture. On the base of that, we do the most likely explanation.
Creates, as you say, a comprehensive dossier on all the world as it moves forward. I get it. But when you go back to the very start, what is there before that? And that, I think I asked you last time, And Professor Meyer brought
What
that
should
up
there be
again
before?
as being the flaw in your position, which is
Oh, the flaw.
what is
Okay,
there
he knows
before
very well.
it
Flaw.
starts.
Could
What
you
is
say
nothing?
it's possibly the flaw?
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist, but what I would answer to Professor Meyer is that we need to explain complexity in terms of simplicity. And of course, it's true that I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang.
So Dawkins alludes here to the fact that we have brains and that our brains work in a certain way, namely reducing complexity to simplicity. And so the limitations of the brain then depict the reality in a distorted sense. Now, however, I want to point out that we never know how much of reality we actually grasp, and it could be that we have a pretty good grasp, that our brain developed in a spiritual sense in a way that it indeed grasps more than just a picture that is simplified and has no resemblance to nature anymore. Now, however, that's a difficult internalist-externalist debate in philosophy, and I'm on the internalist side that I say we should expel the term of mind-external reality and rather deal with the position that Dawkins provides. Although I want to say this is not scientifically secured, but it's, I think, the pragmatically most wise decision.
Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was, it
But it has to, doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke...
Doesn't it have to? I mean,
I didn't
someone,
get that.
Why?
well, someone as logical as you are,
Logical.
I believe you
It's
are.
logical.
You know, you think about this all very logically.
Yeah.
A logical
Like, just take our
mind
logic.
surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
A physicist will tell you that
Yeah, but what do you tell me?
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say first of all.
He defeats him and destructs him with pure logic. Pew, pew, pew.
They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
So this turns into debate about commonsensianism.
Well, it makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. I think you're a logical man. That cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when every part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical, doesn't that make you think again?
We are not physicists. I, like you, am completely baffled by what physicists say to me, which is that you cannot use the word before for before the Big Bang. Time itself began at the Big Bang. Now that is totally counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to me, it's counterintuitive to you, it's counterintuitive to Stephen Meyer, but we are not physicists. And you need to talk to a physicist. Talk to a physicist about that. And they will tell you that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang.
Yeah, but you think that's as preposterous as I do.
I do because I'm not a physicist.
You've just written a book as a biologist called The Genetic Book of the Dead, in which you talk about the body and the genome, comprehensive dossiers and so on. So you're prepared to expound a philosophy based on that as a biologist, which I completely respect, and it makes perfect sense. The book makes perfect sense.
So his criterion is something making logically perfect sense, but this is not a criterion of truth. And he also hints here to something that I would like to call commonsensianism. He says, like, your points make no sense that contradicts with common sense. And first of all, the problem of common sense is if we all rely on what is called common sense, then what to do if somebody says, well, but that is my common sense? Then, no, this cannot be common sense. And let's ask the question, when Einstein came up with a theory, which I don't understand completely, but the time and space are not absolute. Piers Morgan would have said, but Professor Einstein, your theory makes no common sense. It doesn't make common sense. There must be BF before. Like, time cannot stand still. Time must always be absolute and be the same. It must be everywhere at all time. That does not make sense. It does not make sense. So this is the problem with these make sense arguments. And I think there are, especially in sciences, a lot of things that go against common sense, right? I mean, quantum theory, makes sense in mathematical terms, where we have to train ourselves in using these logical instruments and accept a lot of hypotheses. But then suddenly it makes sense in terms of mathematics, but not in terms of the phenomenal qualities of space and time that surround us. So why is Piers Morgan so much insisting here on common sense, while he at the same time relies on the results of a non-commonsensical science? Anyway, we finished this here. I think we learned a lot about common sense. By the way, this also reminds me of the article about collective knowledge that does not relate to the individual anymore, where we just produce knowledge that goes beyond the mind of the individual. That is also something that should be considered. Now, if you like this kind of debate, I think there is a lot to be learned when we take especially these popular positions and really dissect them. Then maybe you subscribe to the channel, and I do that a little bit more. So this was not assisted reading, it was just assisted watching. Yeah, and what do you think? I mean, I have to say about this, like my first book that will come out in De Gruyter Brill in November, it somehow discusses like the question of what is a science and how does a good science have to start, right? So I think like to a certain degree, I'm an expert on that, although of course I don't know any, like not everything that is in the field anymore. But I think it's quite debatable, first of all, what makes a sense, what makes a science. But I think it's less so debatable that common sense is not a criterion of a good theory anymore. So I think Dawkins just finds himself in the wrong discussion with Piers Morgan, who says, well, everything needs to make sense to me, otherwise it must be wrong. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. So live long, do more science, learn more about science, and prosper. Bye-bye.